A cramped room in a Moscow communal apartment becomes the final frontier of the greatest seer in history. The radio turns on by itself at night. Light bulbs flicker, and flowers bloom in the dead of November. Secret notebooks vanish along with a stranger in a black suit. Neighbors hear voices, while the state prepares a secret funeral. The hall of columns fills with fear. Flowers turn black, and recording equipment fails. Every detail suggests this is not just a death, but an event that will change history. Today, we will look into the place where classified documents and legends merge into one. A prophecy that cost a life. On November 8, 1974, in a modest Moscow apartment, a man who held the Kremlin's deepest secrets passed away. This man was Wolf Messing. He not only predicted his own end, but also foretold the collapse of the Soviet Union. The authorities tried their best to hold his funeral in secret, under the classification top secret. But at the wake, unexplained phenomena began that made everyone shudder. On a narrow iron bed, in a small room filled with old books and yellowed photos of world celebrities, the seer who knew what awaited the world lived out his final hours. Messing was 74 years old, but he looked much older. Years of cooperation with Soviet intelligence, endless sessions hunting down spies and criminals, and constant scientific experiments had exhausted his body and mind. In his last months, he often shared his visions and dreams with his neighbor, Claudia, which gave him no peace. A week before his death, he told me, "Claudia, prepare a mourning dress," she later recalled. I asked why, and he replied, "You will need it soon." And his eyes looked as if he was seeing not me, but something standing behind my back. A few weeks before his departure, Messing began to behave unusually, even for a man with such incredible abilities. He did not speak to journalists and refused to see visitors who craved his predictions. Instead, he sat by the window for hours, staring at the street and writing something in a thick notebook. He always hid this notebook whenever someone entered the room. The secret hidden behind death's door. Mystical things began to happen in Messing's apartment. The radio would turn on spontaneously at night, always on the same frequency playing classical music. The lights in the hallway constantly flickered, and his neighbor swore she once saw the door to Messing's room open by itself while he was asleep. The neighbors thought it was faulty wiring, but the electrician, after checking, simply threw up his hands. Sometimes, unearthly, strange voices could be heard from his room. 3 days before his death, a man in a dark suit arrived, introducing himself as an official from the Academy of Sciences. They spoke for a long time behind closed doors, and neighbors heard the stranger raise his voice several times. Upon leaving, he took with him the notebook in which Messing had recorded his final prophecies. After this visit, Messing seemed to be relieved of a heavy burden. "Now I can die in peace. My work is done," he told his neighbor. I did not understand then what he meant. In his last 24 hours, he barely got up, refused food, and only occasionally drank water. On the evening of November 7th, his temperature rose, and he began to rave, calling out names and dates, talking about events that had not yet happened. His neighbor wanted to call an ambulance, but Messing forbade it. "My time has come. I saw this 5 years ago. Everything will happen as it must," he whispered. Forbidden knowledge that cannot be shared. On the morning of November 8th, the neighbor found him dead. He lay on his back, hands folded on his chest, with a peaceful expression on his face. Absolute silence reigned in the room. Even street noise did not penetrate the window. The strangest thing was that the indoor flowers, which Messing loved so much, had fully bloomed overnight, despite it being November. The phone in the apartment was dead, and Claudia went down to the neighbors. But their lines were also cut. Only closer to noon did they manage to call a doctor, who pronounced death from heart failure. Even before the official representatives arrived, men in plain clothes appeared in the apartment. They were interested in any notes or documents Messing might have left. They turned the whole room upside down, but found nothing. The mysterious notebook taken by the man in the black suit had vanished forever, and with it, the last prophecies of a man who was rumored to have foreseen not only his own death, but the collapse of the Soviet Union. A few hours after he passed, black cars with no license plates pulled up to the building. Messing's body was taken away on a special stretcher, covered with a specific sheet. The neighbors were strictly forbidden to speak about the last days of his life. Thus began one of the most mysterious stories in the history of the Soviet Union. The story of the secret burial of a man who saw the future and perhaps knew too much. Wolf Messing's cooperation with Soviet intelligence began long before his death, and was shrouded in such secrecy that even today, decades later, many documents remain classified. What has been gleaned from declassified archives and memoirs of former KGB officers shows that this was a unique experiment, an attempt to use paranormal abilities for the state. Messing attracted the attention of Soviet organs back in the 40s when he fled from Nazi Poland. His talent for telepathy and clairvoyance was already known in Europe. But the Soviet leadership saw in him not a performer, but a potential secret weapon. General Pavel Sudoplatov, a spy master and head of external intelligence, recalled in his memoirs, "When I was reported on the capabilities of this man, I did not believe it. But after several checks, it became clear. We are dealing with a phenomenon. Messing could read thoughts, find people from photographs, and predict events. Such an agent was more valuable than an entire intelligence network." The first serious tests took place in a special NKVD laboratory at the Lubyanka headquarters. He was given photographs of wanted criminals, and with an accuracy of 80%, he indicated their location. His ability to read information from people made him indispensable during interrogations of high-value suspects. How much time do we have before the prophecy comes true? Colonel Alexander Korotkov, who supervised Messing's work in the 50s, said the Seer was brought in for the most confusing cases. He helped expose a German spy who would not talk under torture. In half an hour, Messing learned his entire agent network and the locations of his hidden stashes. But the most secret area of his work was interaction with the country's top leadership. According to some reports, he met repeatedly with Stalin, helping him make critical decisions. There is evidence that it was Messing who warned of a brewing conspiracy by Beria, the head of the secret police, and helped identify his accomplices. After Stalin's death, the attitude toward Messing changed. Nikita Khrushchev treated mysticism with skepticism, but did not dare to completely refuse the services of the unique agent. He was used to finding missing persons and hunting criminals. Former KGB officer Vladimir Kryuchkov wrote in his memoirs that Messing was a living legend among them. He was brought in for cases that had reached a dead end. However, his abilities frightened even the Secret Service officers. They feared he could read their minds, so only trusted people from a narrow circle had access to him. In the 60s, special protocols were developed for working with the Seer. All his prophecies were recorded, analyzed, and compared with real events. Statistics showed incredible accuracy. About 70% came true completely, another 20, partially. His predictions about international events were particularly precise. He foresaw the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, and the events in Czechoslovakia in 1968. His forecasts helped the Soviet leadership prepare for crisis situations in advance. Death came faster than anyone expected. However, there were predictions that terrified the authorities. In the early 70s, Messing began to speak of coming upheavals in the USSR, the collapse of the country, and the fall of the Communist Party. These prophecies were classified as top secret. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, according to the recollections of his inner circle, became very nervous when reported on these gloomy predictions. "This man ruins my mood," he complained. But what if he is right? By the early 70s, Messing had become a burden to the regime. His predictions were too uncomfortable, yet it was impossible to completely discard his services. So the authorities compromised. Messing was allowed to give public performances, but was forbidden to speak about politics. He was placed under constant surveillance, his phone tapped, and his mail checked. He spent the last years of his life under house arrest. He understood that he had become an inconvenient witness, and his days were numbered. That is why he began recording his most important prophecies in that notebook, taken by the unknown man in black. Messing's death was a relief for the Soviet leadership. Finally, they could close the chapter on cooperation with a man who knew too much. But with him died the unique opportunity to peek into the future. Messing's ability to foresee the future manifested fully when it came to his own fate. 5 years before his passing, he predicted not only the date but also the circumstances of his death with surprising accuracy. These prophecies, recorded by witnesses, still amaze with their detail. The first mention of his death was made in 1969 in a conversation with journalist Felix Kandel. "I have exactly 5 years left to live," Messing suddenly declared. "I will die on November 8, 1974, early in the morning, in my bed. It will look like a natural death, but my heart will stop from exhaustion." Kandel wrote these words in his diary, considering them a sign of senile depression. But Messing continued to describe the details of his future funeral with frightening precision. "They will bury me in secret," he said. "The authorities fear what might happen at my funeral. And they are right. My gift will become even stronger after death. Even the state fears what it cannot explain." In 1971, during a performance at the House of Scientists in Leningrad, he suddenly interrupted the session and addressed the audience with an unusual statement. Physicist Andrei Sakharov, who was at this performance, later recorded his words. "Gentlemen scientists," said Messing, "you study my abilities, but soon you will have the opportunity to study something more interesting. In 3 years, I will die. And after my death, phenomena will begin that will overturn your understanding of the nature of consciousness." Sakharov was struck not only by his words, but by how his face changed as he spoke. It seemed as though it was not him speaking, but someone else. 2 years before his death, in 1972, Messing began compiling a detailed plan for his funeral. He wrote down who to invite, what music to play, and where the coffin should stand. He gave these notes to his friend, theater director Yuri Lyubimov. "Wolf Grigorievich brought me an envelope and said, 'Open it after my death,'" Lyubimov recalled. "When I read it, goosebumps ran down my skin. He foresaw every detail, who would come, what would happen, even what the weather would be." The notes included a warning that the authorities would try to hide his death, fearing a mass pilgrimage. But they did not understand the main thing: that people would come not to say goodbye, but to witness something that could not be hidden. Especially terrifying were his predictions about what would happen after death. He claimed his spirit would not leave, but would remain to pass important information to those capable of receiving it. "My death is not the end, but the beginning," he said. "I see myself after death. I try to say something, but people do not hear me. Only a few will understand my signs." A month before his death, Messing began telling stories of strange dreams in which he saw his own funeral. "I see my coffin in the House of Unions," he told his neighbor. "Around stand people, their faces distorted with fear. Flowers wither by themselves, candles go out without wind, and the air hangs with a smell that shouldn't be there." Prophecies almost always come true. A week before his death, a man came to him whom he called the messenger. After he left, Messing told his neighbor, "Now everything is ready. I have been given my last assignment." In his final days, he often spoke to someone invisible, asking forgiveness for what he could not prevent. On the eve of his death, he asked his neighbor to record his last words, but the pen stopped writing. "It means not everything can be written down," said Messing with a sad smile. "Some secrets must go with me, but what needs to be passed on, I will pass on in another way." On the morning of November 8th, when Claudia found him dead, a piece of paper lay on the table with a single phrase written in his hand. "Everything happened as predicted. Now begins the most interesting part." This phrase turned out to be prophetic. What happened during and after Messing's funeral forced even skeptics to believe that some people can look beyond the veil. Within an hour of his death, a group of plainclothesmen arrived at the apartment, identifying themselves as agents of competent authorities. They acted quickly and methodically, as if they had prepared in advance. Neighbors were forbidden to leave their apartments, use the phone, or communicate with anyone outside. The operation was led by KGB Colonel Igor Morozov, who had overseen surveillance of Messing in recent years. He wrote in his classified report that the death of the object created serious risks for state security. Intelligence officers seized all documents and personal belongings of the deceased, searching for something specific. They paid special attention to books, checking every page. Claudia recalled how one operative stared for a long time at the indoor flowers that had bloomed on the night of Messing's death. He even dumped the soil from the pots, then ordered all the plants thrown out, saying they could be dangerous. Messing's body was placed in a special zinc coffin, which was unusual, as the dead were typically buried in wooden ones. The medical examiner was ordered not to perform a full autopsy, limiting it to an external examination. The secret kept in KGB safes. A secret order came from the Central Committee of the Communist Party. The funeral must be closed, without press attention. The guest lists were approved personally by the deputy chairman of the KGB. General Philip Bobkov admitted in his memoirs that they feared the funeral would turn into a demonstration. Messing had many followers who believed in his abilities, and the authorities could not allow a mass pilgrimage. Particular concern was raised by the presence of foreign journalists and diplomats, as Messing had contacts with many foreign scientists, and his death could draw international attention to Soviet research in extrasensory perception. Therefore, it was decided to hold the farewell in the Hall of Columns at the House of Unions, but with a strictly limited attendance. This was the same hall where Stalin had laid in state. Invitations were printed in the KGB printing house and issued only to vetted individuals. The director of the House of Unions received a personal call from the Central Committee with instructions to prepare the hall for a special event of state importance and not to inform anyone of its nature. The night before the farewell, additional lighting and electronic equipment resembling tape recorders were brought into the hall. Eyewitnesses said these were very complex devices they had never seen before. On the morning of November 11th, the coffin with Messing's body arrived under heavy guard. Strangely, the flowers that usually decorated the hall began to wither before people's eyes. Florist Maria Rosanova was in shock. "We brought the freshest flowers, but as soon as they brought in the coffin, they started turning black and falling apart." Soviet journalists were allowed to be present, but were forbidden to take photos or recordings. Foreign correspondents were barred. The editor-in-chief of the Literary Gazette wrote in his diary that the atmosphere was unhealthy. Everyone was whispering, looking around. One could feel that people were afraid. Even the priest for the service was chosen specially. He had to be someone who did not know Messing personally. "This is the scariest thing I have ever seen." Priest Mikhail Voskresensky later said that when he saw the deceased, he felt something unusual. It seemed like some tension hung in the air. The guest list was meticulously compiled. Only about 100 people, which was very few for a farewell to such a famous figure. Messing had no relatives, as his family had perished during the war. So the organizers presented several actors as his close friends. The preparation of the body itself was shrouded in mystery. Messing was made up by specialists from the outside in a closed room. Makeup artist Anna Smirnova, who had worked at the House of Unions for many years, was surprised by such measures. The music for the ceremony was chosen specifically. Instead of a funeral march, they played works by Bach and Mozart. But the strangest thing was the instruction for the guards. They were given special signaling devices and warned of the possibility of unusual phenomena. Guard Commander Major Peter Volkov was bewildered. "I was told to be ready for anything, but for what exactly, they didn't explain." An hour before the start, the entire House of Unions was checked with service dogs. But when all preparations were finished, the organizers were surprised to find that all the complex equipment installed the day before had failed. Instruments showed anomalous values, tape recorders refused to record, and cameras ruined film. Thus began the funeral of a man who kept state secrets during his life and became the main secret himself after death. The farewell ceremony began at 10 in the morning and was immediately accompanied by events that defied ordinary logic. The first oddities were noticed even before visitors arrived. A cleaner who had worked there for 15 years said that around the coffin, the air shimmered like above hot asphalt, although the hall was cool. Flowers began to wither minutes after being placed near the coffin. Those closest to the deceased's head turned black fastest. What if science cannot explain what is happening? When visitors were allowed in at 9:30, the first serious incident occurred. An elderly woman, claiming to be a fan of Messing, approached the coffin and suddenly fainted. Medics could find no cause for her loss of consciousness. When she came to, she mumbled something about voices and visions. He asked to pass important information to someone, mentioned dates, names, some numbers. KGB officers immediately took the woman away, and no one saw her again. Around 10:30, all the instruments in the orchestra simultaneously went out of tune. Conductor Konstantin Petitsa later said the instruments were perfectly tuned, but when they started playing, everything went wrong. It seemed someone invisible was moving the bows. The music had to be stopped and a recording played, but even the tape recorder worked intermittently. The announcer's voice would speed up, then slow down. Instruments brought by scientists studying the messing phenomenon also showed anomalous readings. Physicist Vladimir Ginzburg wrote in his diary that the needle of the electromagnetic field meter oscillated like crazy, and a dosimeter showed radiation levels several times higher than normal. Moreover, the radiation background was uneven. Readings were higher at the head of the deceased than at the feet, the scientist recalled. Around 11 o'clock, all the electric lights, including emergency lighting, suddenly went out. In the total darkness, a faint light emanating from the coffin was clearly visible. Several people swore they saw a glowing silhouette of the deceased. When the lights turned back on by themselves, it turned out that some objects in the hall had changed position. Chairs were turned, flowers rearranged. Wet footprints appeared on the floor. Photographers tried to take pictures, but all photos came out with strange light spots and blurred silhouettes. The death of the seer opened doors to the beyond. By noon, the atmosphere in the hall became so tense that they decided to speed up the ceremony. The priest conducting the service stumbled over his text several times. Father Mikhail admitted he felt someone invisible standing nearby, listening to my every word. The final chord was the closing of the coffin. When workers approached to screw down the lid, everyone heard a sound resembling a deep sigh. It was so distinct that even skeptics could not ignore it. When the coffin was carried out, the anomalous phenomena ceased. Many of those present told of strange dreams and sudden attacks of anxiety. It seemed contact with something paranormal had left an indelible mark on their consciousness. After the official farewell, a secret struggle began for the right to possess Messing's body. It involved representatives of various scientific institutes, special services, and even foreign organizations. Scientists from the Brain Institute claimed their rights first. Director academician Natalia Bektereva appealed to the leadership to hand over the deceased's brain. Messing's brain has unique value for science. Studying its structure could help understand the nature of extrasensory abilities, she wrote. However, the KGB opposed this. Colonel Igor Morozov pointed out in a memo that Messing had access to classified information, and one could not rule out that traces of this information might be preserved in his brain structure. Researchers from a closed research institute dealing with paranormal phenomena for defense needs also expressed interest. Project Psychic leader General Alexei Savin demanded all biological materials be transferred to his command. An unexpected participant in the struggle was the Moscow Medical Institute, proposing a full autopsy. But the most serious claims came from abroad. American and British scientists studying paranormal phenomena for the CIA and MI6 made requests through diplomatic channels. A U.S. embassy official hinted that the United States government was ready to provide significant compensation for the opportunity to study Messing's biomaterials. The one who read thoughts now speaks from beyond. Soviet authorities categorically rejected all foreign offers. A secret note from KGB Deputy Chairman Viktor Shebrikov stated, "Transferring biomaterials to foreigners is equivalent to handing over state secrets. This is unacceptable." Meanwhile, a serious conflict flared up between Soviet scientists. Representatives of various institutes accused each other of trying to monopolize the research. Academician Boris Petrovsky proposed a compromise: divide the material between several institutes. But the KGB objected. Eventually, it was decided to create a special interdepartmental commission to determine the fate of the remains. It included representatives of the Academy of Sciences, the Ministry of Health, the KGB, and the Central Committee. Meetings were held in strictest secrecy, no minutes were kept, and all participants signed non-disclosure agreements. Unexpectedly, relatives intervened in the discussion. Messing's nephew, who lived in Israel, demanded through a lawyer that the body be handed over for burial according to Jewish traditions. This caused new disputes. While debates continued, Messing's body remained in the morgue under special conditions. In the end, after a month of arguments, the commission made a compromise decision. The body would be cremated and the ashes buried in Vostriakovsky Cemetery. The brain was preliminarily removed and handed over for research to a special laboratory at the Brain Institute, but under KGB control. This decision satisfied no one, but the authorities were adamant. Messing's secrets had to remain in the USSR. The cremation took place in secret, with no outside witnesses. The urn with ashes was placed in the columbarium, but the exact location remained a secret for a long time. The official farewell ceremony had been one of the most mysterious events. Among the guests were unknown men in black suits, who kept to themselves and left immediately after the ceremony ended. Famous actor Innokenty Smoktunovsky later recalled, "The atmosphere was unhealthy, people spoke in whispers, and these strangers in black suits were completely silent, just watching." Particular attention was drawn to a group of foreign guests allowed into the hall despite the ban. Among them were American and European paranormal researchers. Their presence at a closed Soviet ceremony was extremely unusual. Later it turned out that permission was given personally by the deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers. Professor Joseph Ryan from the American Institute of Parapsychology wrote in his memoirs, "I was amazed we were allowed to attend the funeral of a man who worked with their intelligence. But I was even more surprised by what happened during the ceremony. The ceremony began with Mozart's Requiem, but the orchestra played unevenly, musicians constantly faltering. Violinist Vladimir Spevak said he heard extra sounds that were not in the sheet music. When it came time for speeches, an incident occurred that almost disrupted the ceremony. Party Secretary Boris Pastukov, who was supposed to give a speech, suddenly fell silent mid-sentence. A minute later, he tried to continue, but instead of the prepared text, he began saying something completely different. "Comrades," he said in a trembling voice, "the deceased wants to tell us something. He speaks of coming changes." Organizers quickly led Pastukov away, claiming he felt unwell. History that overturns reality. Next to speak was academician Lev Arbeli, but when he approached the podium, the microphone stopped working. Sound engineer Gennady Fedorov was baffled. "I checked all the equipment before the ceremony. Everything was fine, and then suddenly everything broke." The academician tried to speak without a microphone, but his voice was barely audible. He constantly stumbled, forgetting words. In his notes, Arbeli later wrote that, "Someone is preventing me from speaking." The most dramatic moment came when a group of artists approached the coffin to lay a wreath. Among them was the famous actress Faina Ranevskaya, who knew Messing well. When she leaned over the coffin to say goodbye, she screamed loudly and recoiled. "He opened his eyes," she screamed. "He is looking at me." Those present rushed to the coffin, but found no signs of life. Ranevskaya was taken to a back room and given sedatives. Later, she said she clearly saw him open his eyes. They were alive, full of some anxiety. After this incident, many began to feel uncomfortable. People complained of headaches and attacks of fear. Children brought to the ceremony refused to approach the coffin and cried. The 5-year-old grandson of a Moscow State University professor asked, "Grandpa, why isn't that man sleeping?" By the end of the ceremony, The atmosphere was so tense that organizers decided to rush the procedure. The last speeches were cut, the music program shortened, and the removal of the coffin was done in haste. When the coffin was finally carried out of the hall, many felt relief. The air became lighter, technical glitches stopped, people ceased complaining of malaise. But the consequences of this strange ceremony were felt for a long time. Many participants told of unusual dreams, which the deceased appeared to them. Some claimed they received important information from him about future events. It is happening right now. Within a month of the funeral, events began to occur in the lives of people connected to him that could not be explained by coincidence. A series of strange deaths, accidents, and mysterious phenomena forced even the staunchest skeptics to wonder if the deceased continued to influence the world of the living. The first victim was KGB Colonel Igor Morozov, who led the operation to classify the funeral. 2 weeks later, he got into a car accident under mysterious circumstances. His service car crashed into a tree on a perfectly straight road. The investigation found no technical faults. The driver was sober, but a witness claimed that before the crash, they saw another person in the car. Morozov's driver died instantly, and the colonel himself lived for 3 more days. But all that time he raved, repeating, "He does not forgive. He came for me." The second to die was ambulance Dr. Anatoly Smirnov, who was on duty at the funeral. He died of cardiac arrest, although he was perfectly healthy. His wife said that in his last days, he became very nervous, saying someone was following him. Especially mysterious was the death of the florist, Maria, found dead in the greenhouse among withered flowers. The cause of death remained undetermined. Her heart was healthy, no signs of poisoning or violence, said the director of the flower farm. And the strangest thing is that all the plants in the greenhouse died simultaneously with her. Many surviving participants of the ceremony encountered unexplained phenomena. Academician Lev Arbeli, who spoke at the funeral, began seeing the deceased in his dreams. He recorded these dreams in a special diary. "Messing comes to me every night," he wrote. "He tries to explain something, shows some formulas, blueprints." Later, it turned out that the formulas Arbeli saw in his sleep related to secret developments in laser technology. Actress Fina Ranevskaya completely changed her lifestyle after the funeral. She refused new roles and spent her days in prayer. Phenomena that broke the laws of physics. Strange phenomena occurred not only with people, but also in places connected to Messing. In his former apartment, new tenants complained of a poltergeist. Furniture moved by itself, the radio and TV turned on at night. Once, they found a note on the table with instructions. "Search in the Lenin Library, 3rd floor." The House of Unions also became a site of strange occurrences. Workers said that at night, footsteps and muffled voices could be heard in the Hall of Columns. The night watchman several times saw the silhouette of a man in a dark suit. Anomalous phenomena became especially active at Vostryakovsky Cemetery, where the ashes were buried. Visitors complained of dizziness, nausea, hallucinations. Incidents of fainting near grave number 347 have increased. "People fall for no apparent reason," recorded the administrator. To stop the pilgrimage, authorities were forced to classify the exact location of the grave. But even this did not stop the flow of those wishing to contact the spirit of the famous telepath. Some high-ranking party officials secretly visited mediums, hoping to get information about coming political changes. Politburo member Dmitry Ustinov, according to his assistants, consulted several times with psychics who claimed to be in contact with Messing's spirit. Ustinov was very nervous about these predictions. Messing allegedly warned of a coming war in Afghanistan and an economic crisis. This went on for several years. Mystical events linked to Messing's name gradually became part of urban folklore. The death of the famous telepath spawned a legend stronger than any ban. Secrets of the Seer's brain. After Messing's cremation, a unique research program began in a special laboratory of the Brain Institute. The deceased telepath's brain became the object of the most modern research methods, and the results were classified. The project was led by academician Natalia Bektereva. "It was the chance of the century," she wrote in her diary. For the first time, scientists had the brain of a man with proven extrasensory abilities. A special laboratory was created in the basement of the institute. Only 5 people had access, and it was guarded by KGB officers. The very first results stunned the scientists. Messing's brain structure differed radically from the norm. Unusual nerve plexuses were found in the parietal lobe area. It looked like an extra organ inside the brain, noted neurosurgeon Alexander Lebedev. Cells in this area had a special structure, and the density of neural connections exceeded the norm by 10 times. Even more surprising was the discovery of traces of unknown chemical compounds in the brain tissue. Spectral analysis showed the presence of elements extremely rare in nature. But the most striking discovery awaited scientists when studying electrical activity. Even after death, Messing's brain cells continued to generate weak electrical impulses. This was impossible from the point of view of modern science, admitted physiologist Victor Gerfinkel. Dead cells cannot produce electricity, but our instruments clearly registered impulses. To explain this phenomenon, several fantastic theories were created. One suggested that Messing's brain functioned in a 4-dimensional space. What you have never seen. To test this theory, experiments were conducted with state-of-the-art equipment. Brain tissue was placed in a super-strong magnetic field, irradiated, and subjected to ultra-low temperatures. Under certain conditions, instruments began to register signals that could be interpreted as images of future events. We received pictures that became reality a few days later, testified technician Oleg Sokolov. Based on these experiments, a secret program called Prophet was developed, aiming to create an artificial telepath. Scientists tried to affect the brains of volunteers with the same methods. Results were contradictory. Some subjects did demonstrate extrasensory abilities, but several people suffered serious mental disorders. One committed suicide, claiming he saw too much. This forced the project leadership to stop human experiments and focus on studying Messing's brain itself. By the end of the 70s, scientists had accumulated a huge array of data. But the more they learned, the more questions arose. We understood we were dealing with a phenomenon beyond modern science, admitted academician Bektereva. Messing's brain functioned according to laws unknown to us. Perhaps he represented the next stage of human evolution. In the early 80s, research was shut down by an order from Moscow. Officially, this was explained by budget cuts. But the true reason was the leadership's fear. KGB Deputy Chairman Viktor Chebrikov indicated in his note that continuing research could lead to unpredictable consequences. All research materials were classified for 50 years. Messing's brain was placed in a special sarcophagus and walled up in the institute's basement. But even after the project closed, anomalous phenomena continued. Institute employees told of strange dreams in which the deceased telepath appeared and informed them of future discoveries. He came to me in a dream and showed formulas we would find only many years later, said one project participant. Here is what experts are hiding from you. Thus ended one of the most ambitious scientific programs of the Soviet era. The secrets of Wolf Messing's brain remained unsolved, but the data obtained laid the foundation for future paranormal research. The story of the funeral participants resembles the plot of a mystical thriller, where the death of a famous telepath triggered a chain of tragic events. In the 10 years following the farewell ceremony, more than half of the people connected to the funeral organization died or suffered. The statistics were so impressive that the KGB created a special group to study this phenomenon. Officers could not find a rational explanation. Colonel Viktor Krasnov wrote in a secret report that the probability of such a number of misfortunes among a limited group of people is less than 1%. One of the first victims was conductor Konstantin Petitsa. 6 months after the funeral, he began losing his hearing without visible medical cause. Doctors could find no explanation. First, the high frequencies disappeared, then the middle ones, he told a friend. Eventually, I stopped hearing even my own voice. But the strangest thing was that in total silence, he heard melodies he had never composed. Petitsa claimed these melodies were dictated to him by Messing's spirit. He recorded several works he called posthumous variations. The music was so unusual that many listeners felt uncomfortable. The conductor died in 1977 under mysterious circumstances. He was found dead at the piano with sheet music in his hands. No less tragic was the fate of priest Mikhail Voskresensky, who conducted the service. After the funeral, he became obsessed with the idea of communicating with the dead, left the service, and took up spiritualism. He claimed Messing entrusted him with a special mission to prepare people for coming changes, recalled his colleague, Father Alexander Men. He spoke of the end of the world, of a spiritual revolution. Voskresensky organized an underground circle where he held seances. In 1982, he disappeared under unclear circumstances. His body was never found. I never thought I would say this. Medical staff involved in preparing the body also faced inexplicable problems. Pathologist Sergei Kuznetsov, who performed the autopsy, a year later began seeing ghosts of all the deceased he had examined in his career. They came to me at night, stood by the bed, and said something, he told a psychiatrist. At first, I thought I was going crazy, but then I realized they were conveying a message from Messing. Kuznetsov was placed in a psychiatric hospital, where he spent the rest of his life. Employees of the House of Unions who served the ceremony did not escape a strange fate either. Administrator Anatoly Petrov began suffering from intrusive visions of the future. I saw events several days before they happened, he told doctors. Constant visions of other people's tragedies drove him insane. Fate was especially harsh on people who had direct contact with the body. Makeup artist Anna Smirnova, who prepared Messing for the viewing, began to age at a catastrophic rate. In 6 months, she aged 20 years, testified her colleague. Her hair turned gray, her face covered in wrinkles. Smirnova claimed that while working with the body, she felt life energy leaving her. He took my youth, she said. High-ranking participants did not escape the curse either. Politburo member Dmitry Ustinov began suffering from paranoia a few years later. He was afraid to be alone, demanded extra security, checked food for poison, recalled his assistant. He said Messing warned him of an assassination attempt. Ustinov died in 1984 of a heart attack. Before death, he spoke for several hours with someone invisible. Academician Lev Arbeli, who studied Messing's abilities, completely changed the direction of his research. He left neurophysiology and began studying life after death. Contact with the Messing phenomenon showed me that consciousness does not die with the brain. He wrote, "This is the only thing you really need to know." By the mid-'80s, the list of victims of Messing's curse included more than 30 people. Statisticians calculated that the probability of such a number of misfortunes among a limited group is less than 1 in a million. We are dealing with a phenomenon that does not fit into the framework of modern science, stated anomalous phenomena researcher Yuri Fomin. Messing's death triggered a chain reaction. The last victim was academician Natalia Bektereva, who led the research on the telepath's brain. She developed a rare neurological disease doctors could not diagnose. Symptoms matched no known disease, admitted her attending physician. It seemed her brain was working in a mode unnatural to it. Before dying, Bektereva admitted, "I penetrated too deeply into the secrets of human consciousness. Now I am paying for it with my mind." Thus ended the grim story of people who became unwitting participants in the great Seer's final performance. Their fates serve as a reminder that some secrets are better left unsolved. In the last years of his life, Wolf Messing compiled a secret testament containing a prophecy about the fate of the Soviet Union. This document, written in his hand, became one of the most classified materials in USSR history. The full text has not been published to this day, but fragments have leaked. The testament consisted of 3 parts. The first contained predictions about the country's near future: Brezhnev's death, Andropov coming to power, events in Afghanistan. The second part described long-term processes: the collapse of the USSR, the reunification of Germany. The third, most mysterious, was dedicated to the time after time. The document was written on 20 pages of a school notebook. Forensic experts confirmed the authenticity of the handwriting. First mentions of the testament appeared in KGB agent reports. After Messing's death, finding the document became a priority. The apartment was searched several times, but the notebook was not found. Only a week later did it turn out that Messing handed the document to his friend, director Yuri Lyubimov. "Wolf Grigorievich came to me a month before his death," said Lyubimov. "He gave me an envelope and said, 'Give this to the government, but only after my death.' I discovered this by accident." Lyubimov fulfilled the request and handed the testament to the Central Committee. The document landed on the desk of Mikhail Suslov, the chief ideologue of the party. Suslov initially wanted to throw the notes away, but when he read the first prophecies and compared them with real events, he became seriously worried. Several predictions had already come true. Messing accurately stated the date of Ho Chi Minh's death, predicted the oil crisis of 1973, and the conflict with China. Most striking was the prophecy about Brezhnev's death. Messing wrote, "The great leader will leave the world in the year of the dog, in the month of falling leaves, when the sky cries snow." This prediction was recorded 10 years before Brezhnev's demise. Suslov ordered a special commission to study the testament. "We approached the document scientifically," said commission member academician Georgy Arbatov. "Most prophecies seemed fantastic to us. However, mathematical calculations showed the probability of accidental coincidence for fulfilled predictions was extremely low. Particular concern was caused by the second part of the testament, where Messing detailed the collapse of the USSR. He pointed to specific dates and named people who would participate in these events. "The USSR will cease to exist in the year of the white goat," wrote the telepath. "It will start with a coup in August. A new time will be brought by a man with a mark on his head." The man with a mark clearly referred to Mikhail Gorbachev and his famous birthmark, Messing also foresaw the role of Boris Yeltsin, whom he called the Tsar from the people. Most mysterious was the third part, where he wrote about events in the 21st century. He predicted new wars, natural disasters, and discoveries that would change humanity. A time of great upheavals will come, he prophesied. The earth will be angry at humans. Some prophecies sounded so fantastic that the Commission recommended classifying them forever. This information could cause panic, wrote Suslov. The testament was placed in a special safe in the Central Committee. Only Politburo members had access. But as predictions continued to come true, interest in the testament grew. Top leaders secretly consulted experts, trying to understand how to prevent predicted catastrophes. Gorbachev reread the testament several times, testified his assistant Anatoly Chernyaev. He tried to find ways to change the predicted future. But his every action only brought the fulfillment of prophecies closer. After the collapse of the USSR, the testament ended up in the archives of Russian special services. Rumors exist that Russian presidents periodically turn to this document for advice. Almost 50 years after Wolf Messing's death, the mystery of his funeral continues to disturb minds. What began as an attempt by authorities to hide an inconvenient truth turned into one of the most fascinating enigmas of the 20th century. Final. The room is empty. The notebook is gone forever. Flowers have withered, but the smell remains. The coffin is closed, but the silence feels alive. In photos, glowing silhouettes, on walls, invisible footprints. The mystery of the funeral turns into the mystery of an entire country. The death of the Seer did not stop his influence. It amplified it. Predictions continue to come true, and disturbing dreams haunt witnesses. Every new fact only brings the solution closer and makes it scarier. The story is finished, but the period is not set. Subscribe. Ahead lie even darker secrets.